All right. I know it's been forever that I have read to you. So sorry about that. But hey, it's summer. What are you going to do? I am going to read 3 chapters today, chapters 15 through 18. It's been a while. Oh, let's see. The last thing that happened is that the kids, somebody stole the kids' mac and cheese, and we all know who it was. It was Will, and he named his new friend Rat Face. So that's quite interesting. Hi, Jake. So you like my T-shirt, Jake? I am Tiger Woods. I know, not really, but anyway. So I'm gonna start reading, and here we go. I'm on day 6, and it is 5:35 p.m. The theft of their last meal changed the castaways' approach to food. No longer could they depend on 11th hour runs for coconuts and bananas to stand between them and malnutrition. They needed protein. They needed vegetables. They needed well-balanced meals. The equipment from the survival pack helped. Suddenly, they had pots and pans. They could fish and cook what they caught. Even durian seeds were tasty when roasted over the fire. 2 forked sticks with a cross piece allowed a pot to be hung over the flame by its half-loop handle. This enabled them to boil taro. Hopefully I said that right. Taro, potato, I don't know. A native root, which resembled a cross between a yam and an overloaded electrical junction box. You know, said JJ in genuine surprise, this isn't half bad. It's almost like mashed potatoes. It gets very soft when boiled, Ian agreed, but you have to cook it well to kill off poisonous chemical that could be fatal to humans. JJ spit a mouthful halfway across the beach. It's fantastic, beamed Luke, digging in. The only thing that tastes better than food prepared by your own hands is food prepared by someone else's. Taro was plentiful. The fresh water to boil it in was very scarce. While it seemed to be raining constantly, it never rained for very long. No matter how many coconut shells the castaways set out, now over 100, the yield was never more than an inch or so. Ian tried rigging a still, something he had seen on National Geographic Explorer. They boiled a pot of seawater under a 3-sided plastic tent made from a rain poncho. The water vapor rose as steam, recondensing on the sides of the tent. Then the droplets ran down the inside of the plastic and collected in 3 bowls on the ground. The salt was left behind in the pot. This was fresh water. That's pretty smart. Seems like a lot of work for a dribble, commented JJ. You got a busy social calendar? Laughed Lisa. I could have, sighed the actor's son, in California. That's why you got kicked out of California, Luke butted in. You were having too much fun. JJ glared at him, but had to admit Luke wasn't exaggerating much. His reputation as a wild Hollywood brat had grown almost as large as his famous father's movie career. Gossip columnists used to call to ask about Dad. Now they wanted the details of JJ's latest escapade. It had been a great source of satisfaction to him. His brow clouded, until Jonathan Lane had chosen CNC in the hope that it might straighten out his flaky son. How could you do this to me? He screamed at his father in tortured dreams every night. But the next morning, he always awoke knowing that he'd given Dad a lot of help making that decision. Their social calendars may have been blank, but the castaways had plenty to keep them busy. 2 patrols per day, morning and afternoon, were dispatched to comb the jungle for signs of Will or his camp. They all took turns searching, with Lisa leading the group every time. Ian built 3 more stills, so one person had to maintain the fires and keep adding seawater to the pots. This assignment also included emptying the bowls of freshly distilled water into the lifeboat's keg. Each fishing trip began with a spirited round of rock, paper, scissors to determine who would perform the disgusting task of baiting the hooks. This was a job nobody wanted, because as Luke put it, the worms are bigger than the fish. I mean, I don't mind baiting my own hook, but if the worms are that big, ooh. Charlotte didn't use bait at all. She preferred challenging the challenge of swimming in the ocean and snaring her fish with a lightning quick hand. JJ volunteered for fishing every day, but spent very little time with his hook in the water. He discovered sea cucumbers and was fascinated and delighted by their life process. Picture a bag of guts with a hole at each end, he explained. The water goes straight through it, but when some poor sap gets beached, it just sits there full of water. Watch this. He picked up the creature, aimed it like a water pistol, and squeezed. Instantly, the sea cucumber emptied itself into a thin stream that hit Charlotte full in the face. She pushed JJ into the surf and held him under. Lisa hauled him out of the drink. I guess Charlotte wasn't interested in marine biology, she sympathized. Ian was in charge of food gathering because he was the only person who could tell what was edible. The good news was that food was everywhere, even on the walls of their home. They would wake up each morning to find the lifeboat covered with giant snails. They're a delicacy, you know, Ian told them, gathering an armload, and a good source of protein. Oh boy. I've never had snails before. In your dreams, said everybody, but after bananas and coconuts 3 times a day, most of them were ready to try anything. When she wasn't in the jungle looking for her brother, Lisa spent most of her time tinkering with the lifeboat's scorched and broken radio. She was a straight A student with a real knack for electronics and machinery. They were surviving, keeping busy, overcoming obstacles. The depression would come suddenly, unexpectedly, without warning. Charlotte might reach up to smooth her hair, feel a stiff, salt-encrusted tangle, and burst into tears. The crying would sometimes last for hours, or Ian would grow suddenly silent and sit for half a day, staring morosely out to the sea, visualizing who knew what. Any mention of Will could set Lisa off. For JJ, it would start innocently enough. He'd been talking about a great pizza place he knew in LA, but then, 45 minutes later, he'd be sitting there on the sand, his arms wrapped around himself, straitjacket style, still mumbling about double cheese and pepperoni. Charlotte ate less, exercised more, and blew up at anybody who dared mention it. Why don't you just keep going swimming, JJ suggested, at your pace. You should hit the Oregon coast in another 3 years. I should hit your ugly face in another 3 seconds, she retorted. Take it easy, soothed Luke. JJ turned on him, blue eyes blazing. Who died and left you, God? And before Luke knew it, he was shouting. The captain did, that's who. And if you hadn't decided to run up the sails in a gale, he'd be alive. We'd still have a boat, and none of us would be having this conversation. Luke watched in angry satisfaction as JJ's face drained of all color. It was the one topic JJ couldn't smirk away. The tears were already on the way when he started running. At the edge of the trees, he turned and spat a single word back at Luke. Convict! And then Luke was chasing him, intent on war. But the low vines tripped him up, and he landed hard, raging at the sky. No! Wasn't this just perfect? Now, of all times, everyone was going nuts. Didn't they see they had to hold it together if they were going to find Will and get off this rock? Why can't they be more like me, Luke thought. I'm calm, steady, balanced, sensible. At the sudden pain in his hands, he looked down. His knuckles were skinned and bleeding. With each thought, he had been having a boxing match with a tree trunk. Oh boy. Sensible and steady. Yeah, right. JJ didn't reappear until late that night. He stepped into the lifeboat and tapped Luke on the shoulder. I'm on fishing tomorrow. Okay, Luke replied. I'm working the stills. For once, he was grateful there were so many chores. There was one final task that all the castaways kept up day to day. No matter what other job was in progress, 5 pairs of ears were always listening for the drone of airplane engines that would mean the smugglers were leaving the island. Until those men were gone, the shipwrecked crew of the Phoenix could not light signal fires or write distress messages in the sand. They would never be rescued if they continued to be forced into hiding. When are they going to scram? Asked Lisa in exasperation. They've got their tusks and their horns. What are they waiting for? That's what we have to find out, Luke said decisively. So the next morning, Luke and Charlotte set off for the other side of the island to spy on their unwanted neighbors. 2 hours later, they returned, trembling. They're searching the jungle, Charlotte rasped. They've got that Doberman sniffing the ground to pick up our scent. You mean they know we're here? Asked Lisa in horror. The dog definitely smells something when it sniffs someplace we've been. Excuse me, Luke told them, but those guys can't be sure what they're looking for. The island's not that big, Ian said nervously. Sooner or later, even if it's just by dumb luck. He never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. The 5 castaways stood rooted in the sand as the thought began to sink in. They were being hunted. Oh boy. All right, that's the end of chapter 15. Now on to chapter 16. Day 9, 10 a.m. They called it the 2-minute drill. The signal came from Charlotte atop a palm tree, the hooting of an owl, a sound that would never be heard on a tropical island. That set the vanishing process in motion. The fires were extinguished, the stills folded up and buried in the sand. A few sweeps of a giant fern and their footprints were gone too, leaving a deserted beach. 2 quick kicks took care of the supports for the sun canopy, and the lifeboat lay flat. Ready hands drew a leafy blanket of woven vines and palm fronds over it. Suddenly, the black rubber craft was gone, replaced by the green-brown colors of the jungle. Finally, the castaways themselves disappeared, melting into the dense underbrush. There was the one electronic beep of a digital stopwatch. 1:57, Ian reported, our best time yet. Subdued cheering and a few backslaps as the heads popped up again. Luke wasn't happy. We can make ourselves disappear, but we can't hide our smell. The dog's nose won't be fooled. Ian looked thoughtful. What if we set out a few fish heads and tails and guts on the beach? That would be a strong enough scent to confuse the dog. It'll also gas us out of here, Lisa noted, making a face. We can keep it wrapped up in one of those ponchos, Luke decided. We'll open it only when we hear the signal. It was agreed that 2-person scout teams would be dispatched to keep an eye on the smugglers. Lisa objected. This would distract them from the search for Will, but the others overruled her. They hadn't seen Will in 5 days and had no idea where he was. For all they knew, he was on the other side of the island where the float planes were beached. They were as likely to spot him there as anywhere. There's another reason to spy on those guys, Luke argued, to make sure they haven't found Will. Luke and Ian had been scouting for over an hour before they spotted the Doberman. He immediately pulled back, ducking behind a dense stand of ferns. Red Hair had the dog on a leash, and the 2 other men were with him. All 3 were armed. You were right, whispered Ian. They're looking for something. They followed along for a while, making sure that nothing was moving in the direction of the castaways' camp. When the dog began to run in circles, barking excitedly, they knew they had to retreat. Ian frowned. 3 of them out here. How many are in with the planes? Luke shrugged. One way to find out. They backtracked. Staying low, they eased themselves down the slope to their spying place overlooking the cove. The 2 boys counted and delivered their tallies at the same time. 3. 2 men on the beach, and Mr. Big sitting half in, half out of the smaller plane. They couldn't see his face, but his thick legs and white suit identified him. And all this time, not one of the traffickers had changed clothes, which meant they weren't planning to stay here, Luke whispered. They're only hanging around to make sure there's no one else on the island. Ian was confused. Where do they sleep? There's no campsite, and they can't all fit in the airplanes, not lying down anyway. It was a good question. They eyeballed every inch of the cove. There was the lagoon, the rocky jetty, a narrow beach, and coral bluffs leading up to the edge of the jungle. No camp. We're missing something, Luke murmured, and then he saw the footprints in the sand. They were mostly headed in one direction. They ended where the beach did, of course, but Luke could envision the trail leading up the slope and into the jungle. The entry point was perhaps a quarter mile from where he and Ian lay hidden. There had to be something there, something that was important to these men. Carefully, silently, they picked their way around the apron of the cove. The jungle became so dense that they were doing more wading than walking. Their progress slowed to almost nothing. That was why Luke didn't quite injure himself when he bumped straight into it. A wall? Ian gasped. 3 steps before, it had been invisible, knit into the fabric of the rainforest. But here it was, the curved, corrugated metal siding of a hut, a big one. Luke and Ian stared at each other in mute wonder. Their island, isolated, deserted, and empty of any hint of civilization, had a building on it. It was mind-blowing. Luke put his finger to his lips. Then the two of them crept down the length of the structure. Cautiously, they turned the corner and found themselves facing a gray metal front with a door and 2 windows. A rusted sign, faded and barely legible, read, United States Army Air Corps. An Air Force base? Luke breathed. In the middle of a jungle? Ian pointed to the sign. Army Air Corps. They haven't been called that for 50 years. This area could have been clear back then, and the jungle just grew around it. Luke sidled up to the streaked and smeared window and peered in. The jungle was growing in there, too. Blasted up through rotted floor planks, there was no one inside. Let's check it out, he whispered. They opened the door. Someone had recently oiled the hinges and slipped through. Desks, chalkboards, filing cabinets, yellowed old papers, and file folders were scattered everywhere. Look, Ian exclaimed. Sleeping bags were spread out on the old benches. A few beer bottles, empty food cans, and dozens of cigarette butts littered 2 desks that had been pushed together. The place smelled of stale smoke. That was a trafficker's camp, all right. This was a trafficker's camp, all right. What was it? Military, definitely. Old and abandoned for sure. But a base? It was more like an office. Ian touched Luke's arm and pointed to a bulletin board suspended from one of the curved walls. Tacked up there was a faded diagram of a hut exactly like the one they were standing in. 2 other huts, much smaller, stood behind it. These 3 buildings seemed to be the extent of this installation. Did they have bases this small? Luke asked. The younger boy shrugged and drew Luke's attention to something else on the board, a map of the Pacific. Tiny pins representing boats and planes were stuck all over the chart. Fallen ones lay on the floor in front of it. World War II, he noted. There were a couple of private offices and further back, barrack rooms with lines of bunks. Luke wondered why the smugglers were sleeping on hard benches when real beds were right here. Then he got a closer look at the mattresses. They were ripped to shreds and alive with thousands of bugs. He shuddered and returned to where Ian was flipping through file folders. Find anything? Ian shook his head. Requisitions for toilet paper and shaving cream. They needed a part for their movie projector in 1945. He picked up an envelope marked Top Secret that had once been closed with an important-looking seal. A dozen or so stapled pages were inside. The first line caught his eye. R.E. Deployment of Junior. His eyes widened like saucers. Junior? Junior, repeated Luke. Who's Junior? The sound they heard next drove every other thought from their minds, the barking of a dog. They ran for the door. Gruff voices outside. The men were right there. Luke grabbed Ian and spun him around. The terror was plain in the younger boy's eyes. He mouthed the words, back door? As they sped to the rear of the building, Luke knew that the answer to the question would mean the difference between life and death. Heart sinking, he faced the back wall. No door, just 2 windows. Jammed and warped. The first one wouldn't budge. The smugglers clattered in the front door, accompanied by their barking dog. Shut up, Mutt, came an unfriendly growl. The second window moved only an inch before seizing up against a thick vine. Ian began to shake. That was when Luke looked down. The metal wall of the hut had come away from the decaying floor about 8 inches. It was their only chance. Desperately, he shoved Ian into the gap and followed. The 2 wriggled through to the outside and crawled off into the jungle. There was no running. The foliage was too thick. But however slow, it felt like escape, desperate movement propelled by panic. And when the underbrush thinned, they sprinted headlong, tripping and falling and getting up to run some more. They were halfway home before Luke managed to get his hands on Ian's shoulders to slow the boy down. Ian, he panted. What was all that back there? Who's Junior? Still clutching the top secret envelope and papers, Ian struggled to catch his breath. A bomb, he wheezed finally. An atomic bomb. Oh boy, what a way to end the chapter. All right, chapter 17. I think I said I was reading through 18, but I'm reading through 17. I'm not sure if I said that at the beginning because after that, then there's 2 more chapters. All right, so chapter 17, oh boy. Atomic bomb. Day 9, 3:40 p.m. Luke said the same thing I did. Luke stared at him. An atomic bomb? Ian nodded fervently. It was all in this documentary on the Manhattan Project, where they invented the first nuclear weapons back in World War II. They were supposed to build 3 bombs, codenamed Fat Man, Little Boy, and Junior. But the war ended after Fat Man and Little Boy were dropped, so Junior never had to be built. He waved the envelope in Luke's face. That installation was going to be used to launch Junior, the 3rd atomic bomb. Luke looked doubtful. And the Air Force just forgot this place? It wasn't a real base, Ian reasoned. There were only bunks for about 20 or 30 people. All they needed were a couple of planes and some place to land them. The concrete, Luke exclaimed. That was their runway, right? And it just got busted up and grown over after 50 years? Probably, Ian agreed. He looked scared. You don't think they're going to miss this envelope, do you? The smugglers, I mean? That would tip them off we're here. They don't care about paper, Luke assured him. Not unless there's money printed on it. But man, was that a close call or what? I'm still shaking, Ian admitted. Soon they spotted Charlotte in the lookout tree. What took you guys so long? Don't ask, groaned Luke. The powwow was held on the beach over bananas and coconut milk. You know, this is a really fascinating history lesson. As I'm yawning, that's so funny. You know, this is a really fascinating history lesson, yawned JJ. But who cares about what happened in some ancient war? Come up with a fully charged cell phone and you got my attention. Unfortunately, Luke said grimly, that old war affects us more than we think. Tell him, Ian. I've been going through those papers, Ian explained tragically. As near as I can tell, this installation was so top secret that they picked an island that was never on any maps. So I didn't think we should depend on anyone coming to rescue us because technically we're nowhere. Luke could always hear a slurping sound as the very last ounce of hope was sucked out of the castaways. They fell into the gloomy silence that was broken only by the steady lapping of the ocean. Will's stomach yawned wide open, sore and empty. It was the mac and cheese, he thought miserably. Before that day, he hadn't known how starved he really was. But the mac and cheese, that beautiful, delicious, terrible macaroni and cheese, bliss for a few hours, and then the payback. The meal had served only to awaken the monster of his hunger. That's how it seemed to him. A living creature, loose inside him and impossible to control. It had started out as rumbling in his belly and had grown to a roar that was drowning out everything else around him. He had tried gorging himself on bananas, dozens of them, but the sheer quantity had made him sick. And still his hunger raged. No, it was beyond hunger now. It was desperation. A numbing terror rose from the tips of his toes as the fact of his helplessness became clear. He was becoming weaker every hour. Soon he wouldn't be able to act, to rescue Lisa, or even save himself. All alone in the jungle, there was only one place this could lead. One way it could end. He was going to die. But I'm not all alone. His fevered gaze fell on the boar, curled up and snoring between the twin palms. Rat face is food. Rat face. He reached for his bow and pulled an arrow back against the string, but go close. That'll give you a quick kill. He stopped short. How could he even think of killing Rat face? The boar had been his only friend these last few days, maybe the final days of Will's whole life. Food, that was all that mattered. This wasn't about friendship. It was a matter of survival. He drew back the arrow. Harder, he exhorted himself. If the first shot reached the brain, there would be no suffering. His eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Rat face, he whispered. As soon as the name passed his lips, he had a startling image of a burly, sour-looking sailor standing on the deck of a ship. It was so vivid that Will could actually make out the word painted on the man's life jacket. Phoenix. Shocked, he relaxed his grip on the bowstring. The arrow snapped off the stretched vine, its dull end hitting him in the eye. Ow! He staggered a little, but he hold on one second. But he hardly noticed the pain over what was going on in his head. It all came rushing back with the force of a runaway train. The other kids, the storm, the explosion, the shipwreck, and those terrible days of drifting on the raft, parched and starving, not knowing if his sister Lisa was dead or alive. He felt a great swell of joy in his chest. He wasn't dead. She wasn't dead. He had seen her and talked to her. That was real, wasn't it? And the others too. By some miracle, they had all survived the sinking of the Phoenix and had drifted to the same place, wherever this was. The others, he had been hiding from them, calling them liars and kidnappers, stealing their food, vandalizing their camp, and their only purpose had been to help him. They must think I'm crazy. He considered this. They were right. He was crazy, or at least he had been. Not anymore. Come on, rat face, he exclaimed excitedly. The boar awoke and shot him a questioning look. Let's go. He ran off into the jungle, rat face trotting along his heels. All right, Jake, I will read chapter 18 too. I don't know what I was thinking. All right, let's see what happens. Chapter 18, day 9, 4:05 p.m. Smell was a problem for those who lived on the island. In this heat and humidity, just the regular chores of everyday today's survival wrung the perspiration out of the 5 castaways. Someone was always battling jock itch or athlete's foot or weird tropical fungus. If it hadn't been for their easy access to the ocean, the stink of the whole group would have been unbearable. It was always harder to notice on yourself. Luke risked a sniff when nobody was looking. P.U. The mud of his and Ian's tunnel out of the hut and the sweat of their desperate escape had mingled with the usual jungle steaminess to create a pretty strong funk. Bathing was always a tricky tightrope to walk. With the girls around, Luke wanted his privacy, but he didn't want to be like Ian. The kid was so shy that he would go miles up on the beach. A simple bath would end up taking him all day. He walked along the shore, past the can opener, to where the sand gave way to rocky coral. He kicked off his shoes and dove through the incoming breakers, letting his clothes wash on his body. He was no expert swimmer like Charla, but he enjoyed the ocean. This was the only good thing about being shipwrecked, he reflected. No beach at home had such perfect water, clear as glass, with not the slightest trace of the murkiness of pollution. He pulled off his shirt and swished it through the waves like a washing machine agitator. Then he wrung it and spread it on the rocks to dry. Next, he wriggled out of his shorts and underwear and did the same. Then he went for a long swim. The water felt cool and refreshing, and some of the tension loosened in his neck and shoulders. Even though it was deep here, he could clearly see plants and rocks and starfish on the bottom 10 feet below. Peace. The ocean was the only place he ever found it, where he could free his mind from the terrible danger all around him. He didn't forget his problems here, but he could somehow separate himself from them. There were times where he could even remember the old Luke Haggerty, the one from the way back before this avalanche of troubles had started with that lousy locker inspection. Here he could lose himself in the pounding of the surf, the screeching of the gulls, the rustling of the wind through the palm fronds, the hooting of an owl. An owl! The signal! Luke must have swum, but he didn't remember a second of it. The next thing he knew, he was scrambling onto the coral, cutting his feet, shins, and knees to ribbons as he leaped into his shorts. Then he was pounding up the beach. He could see his fellow castaways performing their 2-minute drill. The wind roared in his ears as he sprinted, that and a different terrifying sound, the approaching bark of a hunting dog. He arrived at the scene at the same time as Charla. 2 men, she hissed, pushing sand over a dismantled still, and the Doberman. Luke was proud of the group. There was panic in their eyes, but their bodies were pure efficiency. The stills disappeared beneath the beach. Their footprints were wiped clean, then into the woods where they flattened the lifeboat and pulled the palm blanket on top of it. By now, the men's voices could be heard along with the barking. The castaways melted into the underbrush. What's the deal with this dog? It's going crazy. They were no more than 100 feet away. Crouched next to Luke, Charla froze in shock and horror. The fish, she breathed. We forgot to open the stinky fish. The dog smells us. Too late. thought Luke. What he heard next turned the blood in his veins to ice. It's on to something, the other man exclaimed. Let go of the leash. A split second later, Luke caught the sight of brown and black Doberman bounding through the underbrush, fangs bared. It was 50 feet away, then 30. Beside him, he heard Charlotte gasp. His mind worked furiously. What could they do? He came up blank. For the first time, the castaways had truly arrived at zero options. Their adventure was ending right there, right now. At that moment, a guided missile shot out of the bushes and slammed full force into the dog. It all happened so fast that for a second, Luke had no idea what was going on. He only knew that instead of being savaged by a vicious animal, he was still in hiding, watching a monumental struggle. Then he heard the squeal. The wild boar, he whispered. The fight was furious and deadly. The boar's head pumped up and down like a pile driver as it slashed at the dog with its tusk. The Doberman lunged and growled, biting at the enemy's throat with razor-sharp fangs. The boar was bigger and much heavier, but the Doberman was faster and more agile, leaping up to tear at the thick neck. The boar's head weaved back and forth, slashing at the dog's exposed underbelly. Blood began to spatter, but it was impossible to tell which animal it was coming from. Terrible howling, and then suddenly the dog was on the bottom and the boar was in charge. All at once, the two men came crashing through the underbrush. Red Hair was in the lead. What the? He raised his pistol and fired a shot into the boar's neck. The squeal that was half rage, half surprise, the boar pulled back from the Doberman and raised its massive blood-streaked head. The second man pulled his weapon too, and he and Red Hair opened fire. It was a scene right out of a gangster movie. Shot after shot, bullets flying. Luke tried to bury himself into the soft ground. The boar advanced once menacing step and then became seemingly boneless, collapsing in a heap among the vines, dead. The two men ran up to where the lifeless Dobermans lay. I can't believe it, Red Hair was furious. That fat tub of lard is going to blow its blubber all over this dog. Sorry. And all for nothing, his partner agreed in disgust. It was smelly, that ugly hog, all along. That's the good news, Red Hair commented. At least now we can leave this godforsaken bug farm. As the two started back through the jungle, he reached out one heavy boot and kicked the dead boar. Stupid pig. Luke's mind was reeling, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still. All would be lost if one of them jumped up too soon before the smugglers were well out of range. It was only 10 minutes, but it felt like 2 lifetimes. There was a rustling of foliage, and Lisa crept out of the hiding and stood over the body of the boar. It saved our lives. One by one, excuse me, one by one, other castaways emerged from the underbrush. But why would it fight for us? Asked Charla. Maybe it just didn't like Dobermans, Luke suggested. I know I don't. JJ looked into the boar's open, unseeing eyes. Well, we'll call it even on the mac and cheese, okay? Charlotte clouded him on the shoulder. Well, it's just a pig, he defended himself. All at once they heard a whimper. Everybody froze. Luke put his finger to his lips. There it was again, a weak sigh, barely a breath. Definitely human. They looked around. Where could it be coming from? The two men were gone. The castaways were all accounted for. And then Ian tripped on something. He gawked. Luke! There beneath a low fern lay Will Greenfield, white and still. Ian felt for a pulse. It was strong and steady. Oh my God! Lisa dropped to one knee beside her brother. The tattered cuff of Will's shorts was soaking red. She pulled the fabric up. Beneath it was a bullet wound just above the thigh. Oh, Will, she said, voice shaking. Why is it always you? His eyes fluttered open. Don't yell at me, he said faintly. I didn't do it on purpose, he said. He waved. Hi, Luke, Ian, Charla, JJ. Long time no see. You know us? Blurted Charla. Will was sheepish. I do now. Did you guys see Rat Face? Rat Face, repeated Luke in disbelief. Not that rat face, Will explained. I've got a pet boar. Lisa put a hand on his arm. No, you don't, she said gently. Not anymore. But it was a real hero, Will. You can be proud of it. Oh, Will looked sad. Suddenly he winced in pain, grabbing at his wounded leg. Man, this hurts. How bad is it? Instinctively, they all turned to Ian. The younger boy backed off. How should I know? He added. But there's no exit wound, so the bullet must still be in there. He needs a doctor. They don't make jungle calls, JJ reminded him. I'll get the first aid kit. Hang in there, Lisa encouraged her brother. You're going to be just fine. Fine. She was grateful that he couldn't see how little she believed her own words. All right, Jake, here's a question. Should I just finish it? Because there's one more chapter. I think I should. There's only one more chapter. All right, chapter 9. Here we go. Last chapter for this book. I'm sure it'll leave us on a cliffhanger. So then there's book 3 of this one. Day 10, 11:35 a.m. The stills were up again, their small fires burning, not on the beach, but just inside the trees. In their midst lay Will, stretched out on a small piece of cabin top that had miraculously delivered 4 of the castaways from a burning, sinking ship to the safety of the island. Hey, Lise, I never said thanks for blowing up the boat. You were the one who was supposed to be ventilating the engine room, his sister retorted. Shut up and rest. It was a pointless argument, but somehow it felt comforting to be bickering again. She checked the bandage on his wound leg, not having the slightest idea what she was looking for. Uh-huh, she said competently, she hoped. She joined Ian, who was picking heavy seeds out of a durian and setting them aside for roasting. The ocean has to be out of fish before I eat those things, she commented sourly. Ian looked grave. We've got to get your brother off this island. Will's just a big complainer, she pointed out. That shows he's getting better. The bleeding has finally stopped. The boy shook his head seriously. There's going to be an infection for sure with that bullet in there. It's no big deal if you can get medical attention, but our first aid stuff is going to run out fast. Lisa blinked. He could die? He shrugged helplessly. Not tomorrow, not next week, but if we can't get him to a hospital. Lise, called Will from the raft, could you get me some water? You've got legs, she snapped automatically. It was so instant, so instinctive for her to take a shot at him, the result of 12 years of sibling warfare. Practically every detail of her life existed to be in opposition to something about Will. He struggled in school, so she slaved for straight A's. He was cautious, so she tried to be impulsive. What would she do without him? In a bizarre way, they were a team. They were even named as a pair after flowers, Sweet William and Sweet Alyssum. A cheesy move by their parents, she always thought, but now it seemed wiser and more telling than Lisa had ever imagined. What would she be without Will to fight with, to push off against? Would she just disappear? I mean, she wasn't going to cry. No way, not in front of Will. I mean, coming right up. She ran for the water keg. Anything you want, you just ask. The twin-engine plane left first, carrying away Red Hair and his 2 colleagues. Mr. Big left on the second aircraft. By this time, his white suit was a mass of wrinkles and sweaty soil. If he was broken up by the death of his Doberman, he gave no sign. Luke, JJ, and Charlotte watched from their usual spying place as a single-engine plane rose from the water, carrying its illegal cargo of tusk and animal parts to who knew where. Think they'll be back? Asked Charla. Count on it, said Luke. This is the perfect meeting place for the exchange like that. Why do you think they needed to make sure there wasn't anyone here but them? After so many days of hiding, it felt almost unnatural to be able to run down the coral bluffs to the beach without fear of the smugglers. Luke kicked off a shoe and dipped his toe in the warm water of the lagoon. It was hard to believe that only a week had passed since they had, hold on a second. I can't turn the page. Since they had witnessed Red Hair executing one of his own men in their very spot. JJ skipped a flat rock on the surface of the lagoon. Well, we've got the run of the place now. We can throw wild parties. Too bad there's nobody to invite but a bunch of snakes. We can get rescued, Charlotte corrected pointedly. This is our big chance until the smugglers come back. If we blow this, her voice trailed off. Once again, Luke used the footprints on the beach as a guide to find the hidden military installation. Even though he'd been there before, the jungle was so dense that the hut was virtually invisible until the castaways were standing right in front of it. JJ stepped inside and looked around with distaste. What a dump, he said sourly. Man, remind me never to join the army. Charlotte's eyes were wide. It's hard to believe that all this was here to kill people. There was a war on, Luke reminded her. Yeah, but one bomb, wiping out a whole city. She shook her head sadly. It's scary what we've taught ourselves to do. Luke noted that the sleeping bags were no longer on the benches. A newspaper lay folded over one of the seats. He flipped it open. USA Today from July 25th, the day the first group of traffickers had arrived on the island. Luke's jaw dropped. Guys, there at the top of the front page was Mr. Radford, the mate of the Phoenix. The photograph showed him being pulled out of the battered dinghy by sailors on a Chinese freighter. As the others gathered around, Luke began to read. Heroic mate fought in vain to save kids on sinking boats. J.J. Lane, son of actor Jonathan Lane, is one of 6 youths lost at sea and presumed dead after the sinking of the Phoenix, the flagship of Charting a New Course, a renowned sailing program for problem kids. James Cascade, 61, captained the 60-foot schooner, was also lost in the accident, which took place in near typhoon conditions 500 miles northeast of Guam. According to Calvin Radford, 37, the tragedy began to unfold when Lane, 14, inexplicably tried to raise sails at the height of the storm. At that point, wind gusted up to 70 knots and 40-foot waves tore the boat to splinters, according to Radford. He was a crazy kid. Maybe Hollywood does it to them, but he didn't deserve to die like that, Radford said emotionally. None of them did. Luke Haggerty, 13, of Haverhill, Massachusetts, Charlotte Swan, 12 of Detroit, Michigan, Ian Sikorsky, 11 of Forest Lake, Illinois, and Will Greenfield, 13, and his sister Lisa, 12, of Huntington, New York, were the other victims. Radford, the Phoenix's mate, fought desperately to save the 6 young people after a Cascadian was swept overboard by a freak wave. It was only after the schooner sank out of sight that he climbed aboard the 12-foot dinghy. He would sail for 8 days and more than 200 miles before being rescued by Wu Lang, a freighter out of Shanghai en route to Honolulu. When called a hero, Radford broke down in tears. Those kids were my responsibility. I should have found a way to save them. The Maritime Commission had submitted his name for their highest medal for bravery. Jonathan Lane could not be reached for comment, but according to spokesman Dan Rappaport, Luke put down the paper, shaking with rage. I'm speechless, he seethed. Ratface, a hero, after what he did to us? Will's rat face had more heroism in his little finger, Charlotte agreed emotionally. You know if boars had fingers. JJ shook his head. My dad made a comment through a spokesman, he chuckled. A spokesman. It's so totally like him that they almost had me fooled. Charlotte stared at him. What are you talking about? If CNC could sink our boat and strand us on an island, the actor's son explained, then it's definitely no big deal to print a fake issue of USA Today. Luke waved the paper in his face. They interviewed my mother about me being dead, he seethed. Is that real enough for you? She's in on it, JJ argued. All our parents are. They're the ones who sent us to this sleepaway camp of the damned. Charlotte was furious. I can't believe you're still talking about this. Poor Will's got a bullet in his leg. You think that's part of CNC's plan? That must have been a mistake, JJ said seriously. It could be our ticket out of here. Sooner or later, they're going to have to call the whole thing off to get Will to a doctor. We just have to hang tough. Oh, we'll hang tough, all right, Luke vowed. But it has nothing to do with your idiot theories. We're going to hang tough so we can all live to tell the world what Ratface did to us and watch him rot in jail for it. Ian had asked them to bring back whatever medical supplies they could find in hope that there might be something that would help Will. They came up empty in the main building, but one of the smaller huts in the back turned out to be a dispensary. Loaded down with bottles, bandages, and sterile pads in yellowed packets, the 3 started out on the return journey to their camp on the other side of the island. They had been walking for only a few minutes when all at once JJ disappeared. One minute he was striding ahead of the group. The next he was just gone. JJ, called Charlotte, mystified. Down here, came a strangely distant voice. Quit fooling around, Luke said sharply. We've got to get this stuff to Will. No, really. A hand reached up and parted the thick underbrush. They stared. JJ stood at the bottom of a large square pit up to his knees in dirt and rotted leaves. Bottles and gauze pads were scattered everywhere. Is that supposed to be there? Asked Charlotte. Like a trap or something? Sure trapped me, JJ suggested, rubbing his head. I think I fractured my skull. Luke was impatient. If that fall didn't break those bottles, I'm sure your thick head's okay too. I think that's funny. There's something hard down here, JJ insisted. He began kicking at the dirt at the pit. There was a dull clang and he jumped back. Ow! Luke frowned. That sounded like metal. He eased himself into the hole and reached up to help Charlotte after him. JJ was already digging at the earth and leaves of a few mound at the center of the pit. A few inches below the surface, he struck black metal with a smooth, rounded surface. The dirt came away easily, and the others joined him in clearing off the strange object. It was huge, maybe 10 feet long, far too heavy to budge. The thing resembled a very tall black garbage can with fins on one end. Let me guess, ventured JJ. It's chapstick for giants. Luke suddenly just knew. There was no flash of inspiration, no light bulb going off in his brain. He simply looked at the object and in that instant realized exactly what it was. Involuntarily, he stepped back. What's wrong? Asked Charlotte in concern. All of a sudden, you're pale as a ghost. I think, Luke began shakily, I think we just found Junior. They goggled. Wide, staring eyes moved from Luke to the object, then back to Luke again. Charlotte was the first to speak. You're not saying... Luke nodded weakly. The Discovery Channel was wrong. They did build it, and they left it right here. This time, everybody stepped backward. JJ plastered himself against the wall of the pit. A harsh reality dropped over the castaways like a smothering blanket. A hostile environment and dangerous enemies were only part of the problem. Their friend Will was beginning a fight for his very life, and now, thrown into the mix by some insane quirk of fate, an atomic bomb. And look, that's it. Now what are we gonna do? We've got one more book to read. Oh my gosh! I'm gonna have to read the next book. That was the end of book 2, Survival. We'll see what happens. I don't know. The last book is called Book 3. Escape. Oh boy. So I guess I will have to buy or get the next book and read that as well. So hope you guys liked it so far. Hi, Maren. Good to see you. I will hopefully maybe I'll see you soon. Love you guys. I hope you have a good day.